All right, we're in John chapter 1. Appreciate Jerry. I just tried, couldn't get back in time last week. So Jerry told me that y'all talked about the deity of Christ, and I'm glad he cleared all that up and straightened all that up with everybody. I want to go back through and just remind ourselves of these claims that Jesus makes in chapter 1. So Jesus says he was with God from the beginning. He is God. Well, so that almost is a duplication there, right? All things were made through him, that life could not have happened without Jesus. That's a powerful statement. We're going to see a lot of these then dealt with specifically as we go through John with specific stories, often connected with miraculous healings. So it's interesting how John does that. He came into the world. He was unknown, became flesh and blood, and lived among us. We talked about that. You couldn't recognize Jesus. He didn't have a halo over him. He was rejected by his people. And this is an interesting thing, and this is where we picked up last time. I want to read that in chapter 1, verse 9. Let's start in verse 9. So John chapter 1, verse 9. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. And then he says this, he came to his own people, and his own people did not receive him, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And then we're going to look at verse 13 too, who were born not of the blood, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Well, which is it? Did all of his people reject him or not?
Mostly.
Huh?
Mostly.
Okay, then why does he say that? He came into his way. I mean, if you just stop reading there, right? If you just said, verse 11, he came into his own and his own people did not receive him. You stop there, you get the wrong impression. Yeah, it's interesting. You'll see this a lot, and it's done in the Bible a lot, and it throws people off a lot of times. And from what I've read, it's the way Hebrews express things. They would start out by saying everything is like this, and then they'd come back and say, well, except this, this, and this. Or nothing is like this. Oh, but some are like this, this, and this. So we'll see that a few more times in John. And I think it's because people could look at that and say, well, it's almost like a contradiction in Scripture. But it's not that way at all. It's just a way of expressing a thought. So it's almost like, let me grab your attention. You know what? He came into the world. God came into the world. They didn't recognize him. But then when they did see him, or he made the claims about who he was, what did they do? They rejected him. They all rejected him. So you can say that in one sense, that in general, as you just look at the Jewish people and the Gentile people, they rejected him. And so, but it doesn't mean that every single one of them did. Obviously, the apostles, and there were other people in Acts 2, there's going to be 3,000 that are going to respond to the gospel. So it's not meaning that every single person, but just as a whole. So it's not wrong. I think we can sometimes make statements like that. You know, we say our culture believes this, or our society follows this, and that's a generally true statement. It might be true with almost all the people in a given culture or in that statement, but it doesn't mean every single person. And so I think that's the best explanation for what he's saying. So his people did not receive him initially, and even later, although some more would later. But to all who did receive him, this is verse 12, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. What do you think that means? Unpack that a little bit. He gave the right to become children of God. I thought the Jews were already the children of God.
He brought the message and the plan through which anyone who follows it can become one with him. But there's a choice there. So it's giving the right to those who are willing to accept it by doing what he says.
Right. How do you think the Jews heard that?
They didn't like it.
Yeah, they didn't like it, right? Because they already thought they were the children of God. Again, another bold claim by John right off the bat. And I want us to think about, again, this is like this first part all the way down to verse 18 is almost like, I like to think of it as, it's an attorney making his opening arguments. And he's stating, by matter of fact, this is what I'm going to prove to you as this trial proceeds. This is what I'm going to show you. This is the claims that he made, and I'm going to show you that he was these things. And I think if you look at it that way, it helps follow the theme of John all through. That it's just John laying this out. He starts out very clearly. Doesn't spend any time on all the background. He said, here, let's just get to the chase. Here it is, my opening arguments. Here's who Jesus said he was. These are the claims that he made. And I'm going to prove to you that these things are true. And I'm going to show you that it is. And in fact, I'm going to tell you what. You're not the children of God unless what? You believe in Jesus. You're not the children of God unless you believe in Jesus. Jesus is going to later say that about himself, right? Later on in John, the night before he's betrayed, he's going to make a claim about himself that way. Nobody comes to the Father except through me, he's going to say. So he's making these strong claims that John's going to have to back up, because if you were just a skeptical reader, you'd say, wow, what other man that's ever lived could say that? What other man could make such a claim? To all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right. That speaks of authority. Jesus gave the right. Ernie, go ahead.
A couple of points. Number one, this passage is very powerful against faith only, because it says that if they believed, they had the ability to become.
Yeah.
You don't become what you already are. If you believe and that's sufficient, what are you becoming? And here we have that belief enables you to become a child of God, but it does not make you of itself a child of God.
100%.
That's I often use this passage for that purpose. Also, if you consider that, and as I hold to, John is writing to combat Gnosticism, one of the things that you look at with this statement is the Gnostics were very, well, you have to have this special knowledge to become a child of God. You have to be this enlightened person. And what John is writing here is that everybody who believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God has the ability to become a child of God. It's not just your select little cult. It's everybody who believes who Jesus is specifically as God. And I think that's a big part of the case that John's making.
Yeah, now let me illustrate how John will do this. So to what Ernie said, if you go, turn real quick to John chapter 12 and in verse 41. So he starts out by talking about, although he does all these signs, nobody believed him. He quotes Isaiah in Isaiah 53 here, Lord, who has believed our report? So remember what he says here. I think he's right. He came and he gave the right. Those that believed in him, he gave the right to become the children of God. This is why it can't be just belief. And this is how John, that's what I'm saying. Every one of the claims he's going to make here, he's going to show it through examples of people or through the things that Jesus did as we go through the Gospel of John. So if you drop down to verse 41, Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. That ties into John 1, right? About revealing the glory, he says there in chapter 1. Nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him. Well, he's just got through saying they didn't believe in him. But again, it's one of these statements like we saw in chapter 1. Nobody believed in him. Then he said, yeah, but some of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees they did not confess it, so they would not be put out of the synagogue, for they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. That's exactly what he's saying. If you believe in his name, you got access. You have the right to become a child of God. Those people believed in his name. What happened? Did they become children of God? In John 12, did they become children of God?
They didn't confess his name.
They wouldn't confess his name. So believing in Jesus gave them the access to a relationship with the Father. But they had to be what? They had to confess his name. What does that mean? It doesn't mean they wouldn't just say his name. What was the point there?
Telling people they believed in him.
Yeah.
Telling others.
So if they believed him, why did he say? Why wouldn't they do it?
Fear.
Huh?
Here.
Yeah, there's a cost. So what Jesus says, he comes, and if you'll just be honest and believe in him, because you can't really deny that. John's going to lay the point out. You can't deny who he is. He's going to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. But that's not it. It's not just acknowledging who he is. It's you deciding to submit to him, and that's going to bring about what? That's a broad question, I know.
Obedience. Relationship.
No, it might, but if you believe in him, use John 12, what's it going to bring about? A cost. A cost. You're not going to just be able to believe in him and then it's just the rest of it to the relationship with God is just going to be really easy. That's like going to be the hard part. No, John's going to lay out. I can convince you who he is. I really think it's pretty hard to deny that Jesus is the Son of God after going through John. But that doesn't mean that you're willing to accept the consequences of that decision. They weren't willing because they were going to lose their position in the synagogue if they did that. See, that's what Jesus talks about, and Luke talks about later in Matthew. We talk about those passages, Matthew 10, Luke 14. We talk about these passages that talk about the cost, counting the cost. If you don't renounce everything you have, you can't be my disciple. That acknowledging who Jesus is just the start. It can't be the whole thing. Because those people clearly believed in Jesus. They were God-fearing people. They were the religious leaders, but they knew the cost of confessing Jesus, of following him, of doing what he said to complete this relationship was going to be too much, and so they rejected it. But that, I think we'll see that all through John. Here's this claim John made. You know what? He gave the right to become children of God, and all you had to do is believe in him. Well, here's some people he's going to show us that don't believe in him at all. Guess what? They can't become children of God. And then there's some people who do believe in him, but they're not willing to become children of God. He gave them the right. When they believed in him, now they had a path. I like to think of it as a path, an open door to become children of God, but they wouldn't do it. That's the one thing John is not going to do completely for us. He's bringing us to acknowledge who Jesus is, but he's also going to show us a lot of people along the way that were really convinced, but they just didn't do it. They just wouldn't follow through with what it took to follow him. But we're going to see plenty of people who just rejected him outright. Okay, so some received him, some he gave the right to become children of God. Grace and truth came through him. He's going to talk about going to send them the Spirit of truth when we get to John 14, 15, and 16. Jerry?
Yeah, I just wondered if you touch on verse 13 before you move on. That passage is often used to say that man doesn't really have any part in his own salvation because it says you're born not of the will of man,
Right.
but of God.
Yeah, thank you, because I did want to talk about that. So this is one of those statements that he's going to deal with really more in John chapter 3 with Nicodemus. And I'm not sure if I understand the subtleties of this. So when he says, who were born not of blood, what would you think that means? Jewish heritage. Genesis 28, where Jacob has the dream and God tells him, your descendants are going to be like the sands of the sea. I'm going to bless you with all this. So they would have thought they're Jewish because of their blood, their lineage, their physical lineage. I don't know that there's much difference than in the other two, or if it's just kind of latching all that together. So we're born not of the blood. I think that's the easy one. Nor the will of the flesh. I think that I can understand that one too. But I think it's about the same as nor of the will of man. In other words, I can't distinguish between the will of the flesh and the will of man. That seems to me to be about the same thing. But what would it mean? What would it mean? You can't be born of the will of man. What would that mean, you think? Ernie?
So I would distinguish between the will of the flesh and the will of man as the two different parts of this. The will of the flesh is physical desire. You can't just physically desire it like we have our appetites and our desires that are designed as part of our physical self. But also the will of man which is the New Testament, the gospel. You have the will of God is not God saying, I'm saving you whether you want it or not. It's, this is my will by which you are saved that He's revealed to us. And so it's not things that we devised or came up with, it's the things that God has revealed to us by which we're saved. You've got James 1:21, Romans 10:17, a bunch of other places where it talks about the gospel saving us.
Right. Robert?
Yeah, I was going to say, the will, I totally agree with Ernie there. Will of flesh should be just a relationship between man and wife, maybe, to produce something, and then the will of man just kind of by his own bootstraps or his own devices of how he's going to come up with a formulation or plan to bring about being born.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. And that's what most commentators will say there. I just can't really, I don't understand how somebody would want to be a child of God through the will of the flesh that wouldn't involve the will of man. That's what I can't, my little brain can't distinguish those two, but that's okay. But I think the idea with the will of man is exactly right. What Ernie said is, I just think that's pretty amazing. Imagine it said, I know what God says I need to do, but I've decided I'm going to do this, and I still get to have a relationship with God. You could almost say the arrogance of man there, right? That I on my own decide this is the way I'm going to do it. Instead of saying, it's the difference in how we approach God. One way is, I want a relationship with God on my terms. I'm gonna have a relationship with God, but I'm gonna do it my way. You hear people when they say things like, well, me and my God, we've kind of worked this out together. And compared to somebody who says, no, I can only be born by the will of God, that means my mindset toward God would be, God, what do you want? I can't have a relationship with you, God, except by your will. What do you want me to do? It's Isaiah, here am I, send me. Yeah, I'm a man of unclean lips. Here am I, send me. Isaiah recognized it wasn't he couldn't be what God wanted him to be because of his blood. Even though he was a Jew, he didn't say to God, well, use me, God. I'm a Jew. I'm already ready. When he got into he sees this vision in the presence of God, he says, I can't do it. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live with people of unclean lips. It's going to have to be by your will that this happens to me. And in that scene, the angel brings the ember, the coal, and places it on his tongue and cleanses him. You could see how that would play out here. It was the will of God that Isaiah becomes a servant, useful to God. But see, that has to be our approach to God. Is I can't, Father, I can't have a relationship with you based on me. There's nothing here. You're going to have to tell me what you want. You're going to have to cleanse me. And that's, I think, the humility that we're looking for, whereas the Jews had began to claim this relationship with God based on things like their blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. And Nicodemus in chapter 3 is going to struggle with that. What does it really mean to be born again? I think that's the idea. Jerry, did you have your hand up too?
No, I think that's important to make that distinction because this verse is the proof text of those who argue for the faith-only doctrine.
Right.
And they say man has nothing to do with his own salvation. God does it all. That's full 5-point Calvinism. And they use this text all the time. Right. They just throw it out there. See, it's not by the will of man. And then they say, that means man doesn't do anything. And that's not the point.
Right.
Not the point at all.
Yeah. Again, why would John make such a point of this? Because as you think about writing to people who already believe, again, they have a relationship with God. And why do they have it? They either have it because of their bloodline directly, and that's enough, or they have it because they're so good. I mean, I think those are the ideas. Maybe the will of the flesh here could have some reference to circumcision. I don't know. Because I've been circumcised, the removal of the flesh, that now I'm a child of yours, based on that. That could be part of it. But no, I think that's exactly right. The whole idea is that God's established who's going to have a relationship with His Son, and that ties into what we were saying earlier about He'll give the right to become children of God. Those two passages are connected together. And sometimes in here, I was listening to John Piper one time talking about John 1, and he literally would just skip over verses to get to what he wanted John 1 to say. He wasn't a very honest teacher as far as he went through this. Okay, anything else? Anything else on that? Grace and truth came through him. Grace and truth as opposed to what? Moses bringing what? Verse 17. The law. Well, wasn't the law truth?
The law didn't really give grace because it couldn't take away sins.
Right. In fact, from a New Testament perspective, the law is associated in almost in everything with what? Yeah, condemnation, death. The law condemned you. The law, in Romans chapter 7, it's through the law that I learned these things. I became this way. The law is not associated with grace. Now, we can though see there was grace under the law, but in this comparison, as John tries to compare Moses to Jesus, said, what did Moses give you? He brought you a law, and that law condemned you. But grace and truth came through Jesus. The understanding, the real understanding of the law, like he does in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 especially, is this comparison. But let me explain to you what it means. So that contrast between Moses and Jesus. Go ahead, Ernie.
There's a lot of evidence, I think, in the New Testament that really associates the idea specifically of grace that saves with the plan of salvation, and that includes Jesus and all his teachings and everything. So it's not this generic idea of grace, of God's favor and God's gifts to us, because He's given us a lot under whatever covenant. But specifically the grace that saves is understood to be the plan of salvation. And it's Jesus, right? John 3:16, He gave His only begotten Son. But also He gave us the Word, the revealed New Testament that tells us, hey, I gave you my Son, now here's what you do about it. And that's altogether what saves us when we conform to that. That's what grace, I think, really is. And I think this is one of those big verses for showing the contrast between the two systems.
Yeah, and of course, there is grace under the old covenant, but it's based on what? Huh? Then it wouldn't be grace. What's the grace of the old covenant based on?
Sacrifices.
Yeah, but really, what we learn from Hebrews is that it's based on the blood of Jesus coming back and cleansing the sin. So in that sense, the old covenant is dependent on Jesus for grace. Without Jesus, there is no grace. So all the things that they did to fall under the grace of Jesus would have meant nothing would Jesus not have died. So grace only came through Jesus. Nobody's going to stand before God apart from Jesus Christ. I mean, I think that's the contrast. Is Moses could offer things to do that God wanted him to do, laws, whether it's laws about obedience as far as their moral lives or laws about cleansing their sin, but none of those laws had any grace separated from Jesus Christ. And of course, that doesn't come till 1,000 years later. So the grace that they need under the law cannot exist without Jesus. There is no grace independent of Jesus in the Old Covenant. It all depended on the blood of Jesus coming back and reaching back. So, go, Robert.
Jerry, I think it's first.
Well, I was just going to say grace and truth. Wasn't the old law true?
Yeah.
But I think in Hebrews it talks about the true tabernacle. It talks about Jesus being the fulfillment of everything that God foreshadowed. So grace and truth, the truth aspect of that might be a reference to the fact that Jesus is the fulfillment.
The reality.
The true sacrifice, the true covenant, the true salvation.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert.
Yeah, I know some translations say grace for grace. Does it ESV say that? I can't remember.
No, grace and truth, and it doesn't footnote it there either.
Okay, because I've seen it like, I think some translations in verse 16 do say grace for grace, or maybe that's a different verse.
Grace upon grace.
Grace upon, so just kind of a lavish
Mhm.
grace.
Right.
Because I mean, for God to call them out of Egypt, to make them His people, to set them apart, to be the standard for the nations, was in fact, by giving the law too, a grace. I mean, it was going to save them. Of course, the reality was going to be, Jesus being manifest as God in flesh to take away sins forever. But, I mean, there was, in some sense, a grace in God making or allowing them to be the people of God, and then to be kind of governed by His law and to be that standard for the nations around them. So it kind of was a grace in some sense.
Yeah, but what we find out from the new covenant is it wasn't really any grace at all without Jesus.
Oh yeah.
So independently, it couldn't have been grace because it couldn't do anything but condemn.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever we read about forgiveness, like in Leviticus 16, talking about the Day of Atonement, we have to always understand that was only going to be available because Jesus would die one day and bring grace to that. So it's a dependency. And I think what John's saying is you've been dependent on Moses, and there's no grace with Moses. You need Jesus Christ, because grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And Jesus worked hard to tear down their vision of themselves and their understanding of what they had under the law compared to what God was offering them through Him. And as we go through John, we're going to see it's real hard. It's a real hard place to come to. It's kind of like thinking, well, I did, you ever done this with your kids when they're doing something or whatever, and you're just kind of helping them, and they don't even know you're doing it, and they think they did it on their own, but you really helped them. Like, I can remember, playing cards when the kids were young or something, and I'd let them win. After they were 2, I didn't do that anymore. But you did it, and they think, wow, I beat Dad for the first time, or I beat Mom. They think they did it, but they don't understand. At that point, I couldn't have won without Mom or Dad helping me. But they didn't see it. So in their mind, I beat them. I beat you at that, or whatever. Maybe, Aaron, I don't know, did you let the boys beat you in golf sometimes when they were younger? No. Okay. Just checking. So, but they think the whole way that works is not when you just say, okay, you win, then the kids don't get any satisfaction from that. It's when they think they've won. And it's kind of it's kind of like that. It's not an exact connection, but it's kind of like that with God. You think you're righteous, and you're following the law. But then you see glimpses, where people like Isaiah, that even though I'm sure Isaiah was a follower of the law and very diligent to follow the law, but he saw it. He's like, he didn't stand on, God, I'm ready to serve you. I did my animal sacrifices yesterday. I'm clean. No, he said, I'm a man of unclean lips. Well, why not? He did what the law said. You see glimpses of these men, or of Moses and his humility. You see that they got it. On some level, they got it. They realized no matter what I do under this law, no matter what I do in my relationship with God, I cannot get to the point where I claim righteousness. It better, even under Jesus, if we were to get a vision like Isaiah, what better come out of our heart is, God, how can you even use me and talk to me? I'm so inadequate. That's the heart that we should have even under grace and truth. It's not, I don't care what I've done. I haven't earned this. I don't deserve it. I'm on the best day. I'm just a man of unclean lips. And so John is really trying to get us to see that, and we're going to see this contrast between the humility of Christ and how He approaches the Father, even though He truly is sinless, and then how man approaches the Father based on somehow their own righteousness or whatever. I think John draws that out very clearly. All right, verse 18, because I want to get to John the Baptist tonight. In verse 18, no one has ever seen God, the only God who's at the Father's side. Now, there are some different readings there and some different versions maybe. Who is at the Father's side, He has made Him known. And I always have liked that term, and I think it's accurate with the definition, is Jesus explains God. What do we need to know about God by the time Jesus comes? What did the Jews need to know about God that they didn't already know? God had revealed Himself to the Jews. So why did we need Jesus to make Him known to us? We could talk a lot about that.
That's a deep one.
Yeah. And I think we're going to understand it better as we go through John, because we're going to see some aspects that I don't think we would know about God if Jesus hadn't become flesh and shown us some things. Ernie?
A lot of times the idea of knowing, as it's expressed in especially the New Testament, is an intimate relationship. God says, if you look at places like chapter 7, depart from me, I never knew you. Or in John's smaller letters, talking about knowing God, being known of God, and whatnot. Under the Old Testament, because sin continued to separate them, and they didn't have forgiveness of sins because of the blood of bulls and goats, they were looking forward to the coming Messiah. There was still a separation between them and God. Isaiah 59, 1 and 2 talks about their sin had separated them. So they couldn't know God in the way that He wanted us to be in that relationship with Him. And under the New Testament, when our sins can be washed away, we can be in that relationship with Him that the Israelites never could. And I think that's a huge part of it. May not be all of it, but I think that's a huge part of the knowing.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's more than that, too. Think about in Numbers, if you remember when Aaron and Miriam wanted to kind of overthrow Moses' power, they said, wait a minute, why do you get all the power and we don't? Do you remember the explanation there? I don't know what chapter. I have to go look what chapter that is. Do you remember the explanation what God gives them about Moses? He calls him my servant Moses. He talked about, when I talked to Moses, I talked to him face to face like a man. How did Moses talk to God differently than anybody else that I think we've seen in the Old Testament? You remember how he did that? When they were camped at Mount Sinai, and even after that, how would God and Moses talk to each other? Huh? Yeah, but how did it happen? You remember?
You go up to the mountain.
Well, go up to Sinai, but what else? Down after they built the tabernacle, how would God talk to Moses? Should have looked it up. Because the glory of God would descend on the tent of meeting, and Moses would go in there. And you remember what would happen every time he went in there? His face glowed. I think what he's saying there in Numbers is he's saying, I have a better relationship with Moses than I do with y'all. He knows me better. Well, they all had the law. It wasn't that God was giving him extra laws in there, but he had a way, a closeness to God, that he met with God, and so much so that out of everybody in Israel, and even people that we see, you see all kinds. You see Abraham, angels appearing to Abraham, Mary and Joseph, John the Baptist, angels appearing to them, to their parents of Jesus and John, and their face didn't glow. Peter and James and John are on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus, and they see Jesus transfigured, but their faces don't glow because of that. Moses' face glowed because he had absorbed some of the glory of God, because he had this unique relationship with him. I think this is what this is talking about. It's the difference between knowing somebody. It's the difference between the guy that owns the company. I know him. I know about him. He sets the rules. He's the one that signs my check every week. I know him. I see him every once in a while. He passes through the plant, or he comes to see us, or whatever. But I don't get to go up and say, hey, I'd like to sit down with you for 5 or 10 minutes and just talk. He didn't have that kind of relationship. Most of us don't with our bosses. He's saying Jesus is going to come. God's coming down so that Just like Moses got to go in this place and talk to God in this intimate way, God has come down in the flesh, and you get to converse with Him and get to know Him. He's going to explain to you God, maybe in a way no man has ever known, but maybe only a man like Moses knew. And I think we're going to see that. If we didn't have the story of Jesus and Lazarus, would we ever believe God was capable of crying? I don't think that we've seen in the Old Testament God is sad, right? God is angry. God is disappointed. We see those things. God was sorry He made man on the earth, right? The reason for the flood. But when we see Jesus, so I don't know that that we would have on our own said, well, I bet God's crying up in heaven. But we might think that now. Again, everything we do assigning human attributes to God is because God describes Himself that way to us. But after reading John and reading the story of Jesus and Lazarus, we can imagine in our mind that God would cry over us. That His sadness could reach that level. I don't think we'd have thought that without Jesus explaining that to us. I just think all through John, we see parts of Jesus, God, that we just know God better. Don't we say that? Why do you think people say through Jesus, and we don't want to spend a lot of time, I have a personal relationship with God through Jesus? It's not just the fact, they're not just the fact acknowledging forgiveness of sin, I don't think. When most people say that, they say what Jesus does in our lives is He allows us to know God better. More close. More intimately. And I think that's what John's saying. He said, no one has ever seen God. Well, Moses kind of did, but he didn't really see God. And look at the experience he has. The only God who's at the Father's side, He's made Him known. He's explained Him to us. Certainly it's what Ernie says. He's provided access to God, a relationship with God in that way. But just the things that Jesus does as He interfaces with people. We know God loves us from the Old Testament. But we know what? Jesus' love sets a new standard of how God loves us. We understand it better. So now we don't love our neighbor as ourselves anymore. That's not why we do that. We love other people because the way, from what John's going to tell us, because how Jesus loved us. It's a higher level of love. Well, we wouldn't have known it. Some of you can remember back before you had kids, right? You thought your life was pretty fulfilled. Happy, right? And after you had kids, you might say, yeah, it was pretty happy then. But I think what most people say after they've had kids on some level is, I would never go back to the person I was before I had children. There are people who don't have kids. It's hard to explain that to them, isn't it? Because you just can't explain it. You can say the words, but there's nothing like what having children do for us to change us. They make us into different people. Well, having children kind of explains that. You understand it on a different level. What it means to love in a human relationship, I think, is you learn that through children. So I think that's what we're going to see. It's not that we didn't know these things about God. It's not that Jesus is suddenly going to bring something about God we never thought about. It's just He's going to explain it in a different way. And we'll see it. And these men, John as a witness, as one of those men who was with Christ, he got to experience that. That's right. In 1 John chapter 1, he says we handled Him. We're not just witnesses because we saw Him at a distance. No, we handled Him. We were around Him. We were together with Him is the idea. He explained God to us, I think. Ernie and Jerry.
One of the things as an author that I've learned over time, as somebody who tells stories, is you have to show your reader, not just tell them.
Good point.
And so I think you have in Genesis 1, God says that He creates man in His own image. And then He sends Jesus as one of us. As Hebrews talks about that He became us to show us that, to show us that we are in His image. And this is what it looks like when that image isn't marred by sin. And that's, I think, what more than anything really can bring us into relationship and understanding of God, is that, He is touched by our infirmities. Like Isaiah 53 and Matthew 8 talk about the hardships and like the father watching the son stumble and scrape his knee. That hurts us. We don't want our children to be suffering. And so God looks down and sees us, and Jesus experienced that directly, and it shows us just how much God really does love us, rather than just telling us the way that the Old Testament does.
Yeah, because the danger is that we only know God on an Old Testament level. It's not that wasn't great and amazing, but once you read about Jesus, why would anybody ever want to know God only that way? And I think what happens when a lot of times our faith gets weak, we start relating to God on an Old Testament basis. What Jesus says is, no, this is a different way to interface with God. It's a different way. I mean, some of the things David writes, it's like, man, he knows, you almost think he knows Jesus on some level. That's why the Psalms are so powerful. But even David couldn't understand what it would be like to know God through Jesus. And John's going to lay that out. So we're going to see these personal stories of Jesus interacting with people in great detail and see how that is. We're going to see God interacting with people individually. That's what people want all the time. If God could just come down, that's what Job said. Job 23, if God would just come down, I could argue my case before Him. I could tell Him what it is. Then He would understand. But the problem is I can't just talk to God like a person and then here Jesus comes. Jesus is really the fulfillment of what Job wanted. We get to see Jesus literally interact directly with people. We get to see Him show great compassion. And very quickly here in John, we get to see Him show great frustration with man. And so we get to know God better that way, I think. Jerry, it's about time. So anyway, well, we didn't get to John the Baptist, but we'll talk about John next time.